Hi, I'm Brian McKenzie, Senior Fair Housing Education Coordinator here at the Equal Rights Center. As you've probably realized by now, the material we're covering in this module can be pretty dense and complicated. So we've decided to shake things up a bit for this module. To explain the underlying theories and concepts for why a criminal records screening policy could become a fair housing issue, we've invited my Deputy Director, Kate Scott, here today. We're going to have a conversation about some recent guidance that the Department of Housing and Urban Development issued in 2016. Even though having a criminal record is not a protected identity under the Fair Housing Act, it's possible that a criminal record screening policy could lead to illegal housing discrimination. Let's get started. Hi Kate, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly does the 2016 HUD guidance say?
So the HUD guidance issues three major takeaways, but it's based on some really important background information. The first point in terms of background is that there's been a massive expansion of the criminal legal system due to decades of tough on crime policies in the United States, such that almost 1/3 of the US population has a criminal record of some sort. The second point that's really important to understand in terms of background is that certain groups are disproportionately affected by the criminal legal system and its expansion. So African Americans and Latinos are arrested, convicted, and incarcerated at rates that are vastly disproportionate to their share of the general population. So from that background information, HUD makes three observations. The first is that it's never okay to make housing-related decisions based on arrest records alone. And the reason for that is that arrest records are just not very reliable. The Supreme Court has ruled that an arrest record simply shows that somebody suspected a person of committing an offense. The second point that HUD makes is that it's never okay to engage in what's called differential treatment using a criminal record screening policy, but based on somebody's protected class. So for example, it wouldn't be okay for a housing provider to run a criminal background on an African American applicant, but not on a white applicant. The third point is a little bit more complex, and that is that it's not okay to have policies in place that will have a disproportionate impact on one protected group over another. And the way that that plays out in the criminal records context is lots of housing providers will have a policy such as a blanket ban on any applicant that has a felony conviction on their record. We know that because of the data and the disproportionalities that exist in the criminal legal system, that means that African American and Latino housing applicants will have less access to housing when those policies are in place. The HUD guidance also refers to what's called a non-discriminatory legitimate business interest needing to be served. And in the case of a blanket ban, it's not possible that that's a substantial non-discriminatory business interest because it's just too broad and the impacts are too discriminatory.
So how do we know that housing providers are discriminating on the basis of race when they're evaluating a person's criminal history?
Right, so we know that through something called civil rights testing, which is like mystery shopping for housing. So the ERC will engage in civil rights testing and call in testers to our office, provide them with profiles, and everything about the testers is very similar except for the basis that we're conducting the test on. So for example, things like race, gender, qualifications are all made very similar. And then they go out and interact with the housing provider and take notes about their experiences. No, don't make any judgments about their experiences. Just provide us with the notes and report back to us. And then we compare the way that they're treated. And if there's differential treatment, we know that it's because of the factor that we controlled the test on. So let me provide you with an example of that. In 2016, we conducted testing with two female testers that disclosed a very similar criminal record to housing providers when they were interested in renting an apartment. The difference between the testers is that one was African American and one was white. And through those tests, 47% of the time, the white tester was treated more favorably than the African American tester, even though they were disclosing very similar criminal records.
Whoa, that number seems really high. So you mentioned that the white tester was treated more favorably than the African American tester.
Right.
What exactly does that look like?
That was clear in a few different ways. The first thing that happened is that agents would provide different information based on race about the criminal record screening policy. So it might be described as more rigid to the African American tester than it was to the white tester. Another thing that happened is that agents would encourage or discourage applicants based on their race. So for example, a white applicant would be told, I don't think your record is going to be a big deal, you should apply, whereas the African American tester might be told, it's likely that your application is going to be rejected because of our criminal record screening policy. In one test where that happened, the white tester was told that the housing provider would probably be able to work with her in regards to her record, and the African American tester was told that she would probably be rejected, but that she should apply to anyway to understand whether or not she should just discontinue her housing search altogether because of the effect that a 20-year-old conviction would have on her application.
Wow, that's really blatant discrimination. But the HUD guidance also mentions another type of discrimination that may occur when a housing provider is evaluating a criminal record. This is a more subtle form of discrimination. What do housing providers need to know about that?
That's right. So this relates to policies that housing providers might have, and the idea that a policy that on its face seems like it's racially neutral, for example, could have a disproportionate impact on some groups over others. So for example, a blanket ban on people that have a felony conviction on their record. We know that in some communities in this country, African Americans are more than 10 times as likely as whites to have a felony conviction on their record. So that policy has a disparate impact on African Americans and would therefore be a likely violation of the Fair Housing Act, because the other part is that there are alternatives to having such a broad policy that would make it more acceptable.
That's a lot of information to take in. How can you tell whether or not a policy then has a discriminatory effect?
So the HUD guidance points to sort of a three-pronged analysis here. The first is that data will show that a policy is having a discriminatory effect on one protected group over another. So for example, the idea that African Americans are convicted at 10 times the rate of whites in some communities is an example of that data. The second prong then is that the housing provider can say that they have that policy in place because of a legitimate non-discriminatory business interest that they have. And then the third point is whether or not there's a less discriminatory alternative. So in the instance of a blanket ban, for example, there is an obvious less discriminatory alternative, which is an individualized review of each applicant, even if you're using the criminal record screening information.
So what factors should a housing provider consider when they're evaluating whether or not to accept an applicant?
Great, so that's a great question. The HUD guidance points to a few different factors that housing providers can consider. The first is whether or not a conviction actually occurred. The second is the nature and severity of the crime. The third has to do with timing. So how old was the applicant at the time that the crime was committed, and how long has it been since the crime was committed? And then finally, the housing provider should look to see what sort of rehabilitative efforts the applicant has undertaken since they committed the crime.
Got it. Let me see if I've got this straight. Housing providers may still require individuals to undergo a criminal record screening, and providers may still use the results to determine eligibility for housing, right?
That's right.
So a Fair Housing Act violation may occur when a housing provider treats two people with comparable criminal pasts differently.
That's right, based on their membership in a protected class.
And then if a housing provider only considers arrests, those are never going to be considered a legitimate criminal records policy, right?
Exactly.
And then lastly, if a housing provider uses a criminal records check where the burden falls more often on members of one protected class, like a blanket ban, that's never going to be considered legitimate either.
That's right.
So housing providers should use an individualized review to determine whether or not a person is eligible to receive housing based on their criminal record.
That's exactly right.
Thanks, Kate, for being here today and answering all of our questions. Well, thanks for watching our interview today. We'll discuss some of these topics more in depth in later course modules.